Good afternoon. Welcome to the Flagler Museum and to the Whitehall, the 2023 Whitehall Lecture Series. My name is John Blades. I'm the director of the Flagler Museum, and it's a pleasure to see you all here this afternoon. We're not all here, some more people will drift in, but we need to get started. So I want to welcome as well those who've joined us online. These lectures are live streamed online, so if you aren't able to make it for the lecture in person, you're certainly welcome to join these lectures online, and we also archive them on the website. I want to thank our sponsors for making this possible. Related Southeast is our lead sponsor for this lecture series, and First Republic Bank and Smith Architectural Group are all helping to make this possible. I want to take just a second to remind you to silence your cell phones. Please put them in silent mode. And if you happen to wander in with one of our audio tour ones, please raise your hand. Let's collect that, because the AV system here can set the alarm off in those audio ones, and it will wake the dead. It's not a pleasant experience. Let's see. Oh, I think we're down to introducing the speaker, who is a longtime friend of mine and doesn't agree to do public lectures much anymore, but graciously offered or agreed to. I twisted her arm pretty hard. She is going to do our first lecture to tell us about the École of Beaux-Arts, and our last lecture to talk about Curran Hastings, the architects of Whitehall, and she literally wrote the book on that subject. So it's a great bookend for the lecture series. Dr. Osman has worn a lot of hats during her career, and I'm sure she's not nearly finished yet. She tells me she's sort of retired, but I don't believe it. She's currently a member of the Antiquities Coalition Advisory Council, and prior to that, get this, she held positions as the Director of Museum Affairs at the Preservation Society of Newport County, the Director of Woodlawn Plantation in Frank Lloyd Wright's Pope Leahy House in Alexandria, Virginia, the Deputy Director of Vizcaya Museum and Gardens in Miami, the Chief Curator at this museum, Guest Curator at the Maryland Historical Society, Curator and Restoration Project Manager for Catazan on the west coast of Florida, and she's held various research positions at the Smithsonian and the Curator's Office at the White House. She graduated with honors from Brown University, earned both her master's degree in architectural history and her doctorate degree from the University of Virginia. And she's the author of several books, including Curran Hastings, The Masterworks, that she co-authored with Heather Ewing, Great Houses of the South. We have copies of that. If you'd like to get a copy of that after the lecture, I'm sure she'd be happy to sign her copies. And she's a contributing author to the Smithsonian's History of America in 101 Objects. So with that, please help me welcome Lori Osman to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
Thank you, Mr. Blades. And I'd like to begin by apologizing, as one shouldn't, to the people in the back that if I don't look at you, it's because there's a light shining in my eyes. It's not because I'm not thinking of you. Yeah. And is that sound level all right? It sounds frighteningly loud to me. For many of us, the term Beaux-Arts architecture most immediately brings this to mind, the White City. And thanks to Eric Larson and his novel, The Devil in the White City, perhaps serial killers. But we will not talk about them today. The history of American Beaux-Arts architecture, first written by architects for architects, focused on its formal characteristics, which are neatly epitomized here. Monumental buildings in a unified Renaissance-derived classical style, symmetrically arranged around a central axis, in this case, a reflecting pool, with a hierarchy of importance, in this case, culminating on the dome of the architect Richard Morris Hunt's administration building, with a counterpoint monument, and we're looking at the back of Daniel Chester French's sculpture of the Republic. But today, I'd like to share my thoughts on the questions that always interested me. How did we get from an art school in Paris to Chicago, and what happened next? How did the Beaux-Arts lay claim to many of our signature buildings, from the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., to the New York Public Library, to Barnard Maybeck's Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, Newport's Marble House, Boston's McKim Public Library, and here in South Florida, Vizcaya, which is a double Beaux-Arts because both the architect, Raoul Hoffman, attended the École des Beaux-Arts in architecture, and the designer, Paul Chalfin, went there as a painter. So how did this style conquer the country? The Beaux-Arts gave us some of our most influential architects, many of whom you will be hearing more about in this lecture series. From Richard Morris Hunt on the left in a painting by John Singer Sargent, a painter who studied at the École des Beaux-Arts. Hunt was the first American to be accepted to study architecture at the École, and that was in 1846. Through Charlie McKim, who was, I believe, third, Carrere and Hastings, both attended the École, and Julia Morgan, who was the first woman of any nationality to be accepted in 1897. And the term has come to encompass those who did not study Paris at all, yet became leading advocates for Beaux-Arts principles of design. And those range from Daniel Burnham, the design director of the World's Columbian Exposition, to Mead, the silent partner of McKim, Mead and White, who studied architecture in Florence, which really isn't shabby. Stanford White
and Horace Trumbauer, both of whom had no formal architectural training at all. I'd also like to make note of the two gentlemen at the bottom, Paul Philippe Cray and E.L. Masqueray, who were both French architects who graduated from the École and came to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century because they saw the opportunity to make their mark here, as they both did not only as architects but as very influential teachers. And there are outliers. The Beaux-Arts trained architects who pursued a very different direction, and as a result left a very different legacy. H.H. Richardson on the left, who was the second American to attend the École, and he actually went for a year, and then his family went broke in the Civil War. He came back, and then went back to Paris and finished up his studies. And Louis Sullivan, who was our most notable dropout, who left the École after 6 months, complaining that he tried to force designers into a mold. A statement that is belied, I think we'll see, by his own work and his unexpected consequences. Today I'd like to propose that the social and political climate surrounding the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris in the late 19th and early 20th centuries gave rise to a design philosophy that was, to contradict Sullivan, all about flexibility and adaptation. And led by Hunt in the United States, it became a movement to elevate architecture and the applied arts in the United States to the forefront of public discourse, not only in the United States, but abroad. And we will begin by looking at some of these ideas as they were formulated at the École in France. So we'll be spending about the first half of our talk in France. I hope no one minds. And then move on to how these ideas played out and were translated here in the United States. We'll see that the lessons that American architects garnered from the École extended beyond the formal and technical aspects of composition into the realm of cultural discourse in a movement that sought, and I believe achieved, an enduring collective poetry of place. So we will start at the beginning. What was the École? Most fundamentally and literally, it was, as the term would suggest, a school. But it wasn't like an American university program, so I'd like to spend a few minutes explaining how it was set up, how it evolved, how it was set up, and what American students experienced there. There's been a lot of debate about who graduated from the École, and did this architect actually go to the École? And there aren't always simple answers to that question. The École began as the Académie Royale, a training program for artists, sculptors, architects, as well as engravers, metalsmiths, tapestry workshops, to serve the French monarchy, and specifically the monarchy of Louis XIV. Painting and sculpture were the first disciplines under the Académie Royale umbrella in 1648, and by 1671, architecture was brought into the fold. And the purpose of this was to unify the arts under the monarchy to create what we might today call a visual identity kit, or branding. There was a consistency of style, symbolism, and even choices of color to achieve a legibility through representation, so that you knew from a mile away that this was a portrait of the king, and you knew what that meant. That a portrait like this one would have been copied and sent to regional town halls. And then Bernini's sculpture, a very similar pose and expression of the king as, in this case, a warrior, carried out through the architecture. And here in the famous Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. And this conception of a unified image of the monarchy was so successful that French architects and artists were poached by other monarchs across Europe and even into Russia to do the same thing for them. The conflation of the monarch, who under Louis XIV's divine right was chosen by God, and then there was also classical imagery. Well, he was also Apollo, the sun god. This was not only expressed through the standalone objects of art in the interiors, but it extended out into the landscape. And so the body politic extended from the smallest detail of the king's jewelry, and as many as you know, the king's bedroom was in the center axis of Versailles. When he rose in the morning, it was as the sun, Apollo, the sun god, was lighting up the land, and these alleys, which turned into roads across the landscape, were the rays of his power going across the nation. So this very clearly expressed what the values and where the hierarchy of power was within France. And these designers were good at their jobs. They were very good at it, which became a big problem in 1789, or more precisely 1793, when the monarchy fell and the principles that the École had been charged with expressing were cast into disgrace. On the left, you'll see an engraving of Alexandre Lenoir defending the tomb of Louis XII at the Abbey of Saint-Denis. During the Revolution, buildings were destroyed, monuments vandalized in a frenzy of anti-church, anti-monarchy, anti-aristocratic iconoclasm. I just read this morning that of 300 churches in Paris before the Revolution, only 97 of them survived at all the period of iconoclasm during the French Revolution. The École was disbanded in 1793, and through a series of typically French bureaucratic maneuvers, reopened in 1816. And it was now the Academy of Architecture, no longer the Royal Workshops, and it was under the umbrella of this new Institut des Beaux-Arts. And it was one of 5 departments of the Institute of France. And we don't have an equivalent in this country, but it's essentially a ministry of culture, a government-sanctioned office of culture. The Institute of France has 3 goals, and they state these to this day: to perpetuate excellence in thought and architectural heritage, to foster the arts, sciences, and humanities throughout society, and to enlighten public discourse through the transfer of knowledge. The École had moved out of the royal palace onto the left bank into a new campus housed in an abandoned and sacked monastery. Lenoir's collection of fragments of statues and buildings that he had gathered from cathedrals and chateaux that had been damaged during the Revolution, many of them were assembled in a museum and displayed here on the gateway, an entrance into the École. That is actually the entrance to the Chateau de Gaillon, the entire thing that he salvaged. And it told students as they walked through that gate that heritage was going to be the foundation of the curriculum there. And then for the next 150 years, the challenge would be keeping the artistic tradition alive while changing the message that it conveyed so that it was no longer associated with the church, the king, and the aristocracy that France had rejected in the Revolution. So what did it mean to be a student there? One had to be between 15 and 30 years old. And that meant that you had students at varying levels of ability, and sometimes, particularly later in the 19th century, American architects would go after they'd already graduated from college. So they had to leave when they turned 30. Famously, the architect Julia Morgan passed her final exams days before her 30th birthday. The first thing one did was find an atelier, a studio, which was led by a master architect, a graduate of the École, a successful architect, and they didn't really turn anyone down. You paid them a modest fee by the week to set up your drawing board in their studio. And there's at least one wonderful handbook for Americans. I found one from 1887 explaining how to find a place to stay, how to choose your atelier. And they advised that you should go to the atelier in the morning because the smoke and the overcrowding made it very smelly and hot by the afternoon. And you would probably want to get out in the afternoon and go sightseeing instead. Typically, after 1 year of preparatory study under the guidance of the master architect, you would take an entrance exam, a concours. And the concours, they would have an arbitrary number of spaces that they would admit. 1 year they would take 20 people, the next year they might take 50. Everyone was ranked. So again, Julia Morgan, on her first or second attempt, I believe it was her first, she placed 37, and they said, oh, sorry, we've only got 36 places available. So she had to wait until another exam was administered. They just took a fixed number of people. You also knew exactly where you stood. So there were some American architects who got in right under the wire, and it may have been a tight year. And there were some, like Tommy Hastings, who placed 14 out of 38 and got in on his first try. Once you were admitted to the second class, you were given a series of increasingly difficult problems, starting with simple, relatively simple design challenges such as this one, design a ballroom garden pavilion. And that was a 12-hour problem. Once you completed the problem, you rushed to the Ecole headquarters to deliver your drawings. And here's, I thought, a wonderful image of the students lining up beneath the statue of the Muse Melpomene, the Muse of Tragedy, which was perhaps a little ironic, but she's also divine inspiration, clamoring to get their drawings in under the wire. And that was the affiliation with the École. You were in an independent atelier, but by being accepted, you were eligible to participate in these competitions. Once you had succeeded in enough of the competitions, you were allowed to advance to the first class. And many people chose to leave after a year or two. They ran out of money, they ran out of patience. It was enough. It was all self-directed. The École did not award diplomas until the late 1860s, and the first American did not earn a diploma until the 1890s. The Grand Concours problem tended to be monumental, complex, loaded with symbolism and incorporating landscape design. And this is because the École was focused on training architects for French government service. There was an emphasis on creating a national, unifying imagery through architecture. The Grand Concours jury was drawn from the membership of all 5 branches of the Institute of France, so that included scientists and philosophers, which explains this was a monument, memorial to Joan of Arc. They would come up with, memorials to famous scientists, some kind of nutty things that were never really going to be built, but they were design exercises. The winner of the Grand Concours, the prize was the Rome Prize. It was usually about 4 years, sponsored by the state to study antiquities in Rome. But that only worked if you were a French citizen. So if you weren't, after you had done your Grand Concours, you came back to the United States. And I think that the process and the system that they had in France and the involvement of the Institute of France is important because it defined for architects coming back to the United States, architecture was a fine art, it was a liberal art, it was different than building. And that was a great concern for 19th century architects. So what did they teach there? So we saw there was an educational system. And I made a fast and loose chart from information contained in Jean Carlion's book on Americans at the École, mapping attendance. And you can see in the first 15 years or so, there was a trickle. That was Hunt, Richardson, McKim. Then it starts to pick up right around the Civil War. 15 in those early years, then it goes up to over 100. And there's a newfound sense of urgency in the United States after the Civil War. We need a unified national imagery as well. And around the time of the World's Columbian Exposition, it just begins to skyrocket. Then, after the turn of the century, we run into World War I, the Depression, ultimately World War II, and a change in the zeitgeist, if you will, a change in taste. That means that the last American left the École, he was admitted in 1933 and completed his studies in 1946. So one of the primary lessons was the importance of defining a cohesive, legible national image in architecture from a foundation of a discredited past. And what they often did was to try to improve upon history, to tweak it, not do something radically different. The picture on the left is an engraving of how the Sully Pavilion appeared in the Louvre in a painting in the 17th and 18th century, before the French Revolution. And then when it was rebuilt, expanded, restored in the 19th century, it was embellished. There was a sculptural embellishment. It was improved upon. And this was a need to find a clearer expression through the sculptural programs to say that this is now about the people of France. This is no longer the residence of the monarch. This is now a museum. This is now a public space. Richard Morris Hunt was not only the first and arguably most successful American Beaux-Arts graduate, insofar as he actually worked for the French government as a French government architect. And I don't think that happened with anyone else. And worked on no less than the Louvre, on the library pavilion, which now faces the Rue de Rivoli. If you know Paris, it's right across from the Hotel du Louvre. His atelier master was Lefwell. It was his project, and Lefwell stated Hunt was not just overseeing works. He was actively involved in design. So we have an young American architect who is functioning at the very pinnacle of European architecture in the 1840s. He brings back to the United States with him these ideas about updating history, about the status of the architect, to craft an enduring, and the notion of crafting an enduring national image. Tied into this was also city planning, urban planning. Hunt and others saw firsthand what could be achieved in making a national capital, remaking a national capital on a monumental scale using classical design principles. In the case of Paris on the left, a sort of before, much of Paris was still a medieval city. It was chaotic, it was dirty, the streets didn't line up, they burned down because they were made of wood. Until in the 1850s, right around the time Hunt was there, the Baron Georges-Eugène Haussmann, had the very unglamorous title Prefect of the Seine, undertook a sweeping program of public works. The medieval city was swept away, and in its place, more sanitary, proper water systems, sewer systems were put into place. Boulevards were now lined with upper and middle class apartment buildings, which is an entirely new building type. Up until that point, you either had your own house in the city or you lived in a slum. There were now these grand apartment buildings with shops and cafes on the first floor. And formally, it was all very regulated on these wide boulevards, which critics point out were wide enough for an entire regiment to march down if the populace got out of hand. But terminating at these key points, monuments of collective historic pride. Old ideas adapted to the new social order. Charles Garnier in the Paris Opera. The royal palace, in essence, became public space, and that's epitomized by the opera, which was the social hub of the Second Empire and Third Republic, the last quarter of the 19th century. They were now designing for a new elite, the Ecole architects, wealthy industrialists and financiers, with the professional classes now adopting some of the perquisites previously only available to the hereditary aristocracy. And the layers of symbolism were no longer specifically about the king. And in the Paris Opera, going from the bottom up, it starts with types of music, then composers, then allegories of the arts, and ends with Apollo on the top. But Apollo is not Louis XIV anymore. Apollo is the Sun King and represents the arts of France. And if that sounds fanciful, I think the compare and contrast between the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles and the Grand Foyer of the Paris Opera kind of drives it home. The idea that the Hall of Mirrors, which had been conceived for royalty, was now remade for the new wealthy elite of Parisian society. But it was for the people, no longer for royalty. Old building types, like the Trianon of Versailles, were no longer also royal titles, and architects were there ready to step in. Tradition had provided a legible language of luxury that the new client class was ready to adopt and enjoy. There were not only in their houses, here on the right, but in new building types like railroad stations, grand hotels, restaurants, department stores. Ecole architects were ready to adapt to new forms, like palaces, to serve modern society. But not every École architect worked for the French government. Some went to other places in France, other places throughout the world. And for them, the École came up with a series of treatises, a series of books and premises for adapting to your local situation. Theorists and professors like Julien Guadet, and César Dali advocated for architecture's need to respond to local conditions. So, for example, on the right, this was a Norman double house for a middle-class family. On the far left, you'll see there's the opportunity to look at French Renaissance chateau and building from that. The idea was that there was more than one possibility within the École, that looking at the specifics of different regions within France, the needs of the builder or the patron, one had an opportunity to do something appropriate that expressed the identity of that region. And the École wasn't completely stuck in the past. As later critics would often claim, there were professors like Félix Dubon who took new materials like cast iron out of the functionalist realm of bridges and railway sheds and turned them into the formal elevated cultural sphere. And at the bottom, the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève. The idea of using cast iron for a formal building was radical. On the Monet up above on the left is romanticizing this cast iron architecture that people had really just thought of as train sheds. And here now something modern, something new was seen as something wondrous. And even Viollet-le-Duc, who spent the first half of his career railing against new technology and new buildings, came to see it as a means to take old forms and take them a logical step further, sometimes with completely crazy results. On the lower right, where he took a Gothic building and tried to turn it into a modern concert hall by adding cast iron, and fortunately that thing was never built. And restoration. The École had always encouraged its students to study the ruins of ancient buildings for inspiration, but in the wake of the French Revolution, restoring old buildings went from being an interest to a bit of an obsession. I show here on the left one proposed restoration of the Parthenon, with Athena really getting out of hand there, going all the way through the roof. And on the right, a plaster cast in one section of the Parthenon in the courtyard of the École that was there as a study piece. And just as artifacts were no longer just for the past, they were there to be studied and built upon. They were starting points for creativity and imagination. Palaces like the Louvre were converted to museums, and a government agency was established in the 1830s to oversee the restoration of cathedrals and chateaux as part of the national cultural patrimony. Richard Morris Hunt's first job, before he worked at the Louvre, was an assignment with the French government to be a surveyor of historic monuments, assigned to Loire Valley Chateau. And on the left, that was while looking pretty beat up after the revolution, and on the right, celebrating how it was restored and opened as a public museum. And if you think Richard Morris Hunt wasn't taking notes and keeping them in his back pocket for future reference, there is Bois on the left, and 40 years later, his design for Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina. So Hunt is putting away in the back of his mind ideas in France that would guide his entire career. and in doing so, also the future of American architecture. So, how did this play out in the United States? How did the discourse and practice of architecture at the École translate to a completely different circumstance here? First, professionalism of the practice of architecture. The U.S. had no architecture school before the Civil War. There were engineering programs that taught civil design and technical, but nothing design-centered program. So soon after returning to the United States in 1855, Richard Morris Hunt began working his very impressive network of influential friends to find an investor to help him build the building at the far left, the 10th Street Studio. There he trained aspiring architects like Frank Furness, William Ware, George B. Post in Ecole principles and whether to go out and start their own practices or to prepare for the entrance exams to attend the Ecole themselves. In the center, MIT. William Ware, who studied with Hunt, was the first professor of architecture at the first formal university architecture program in the United States, and that's MIT. It is estimated that during his time there, he trained over 235 architects. He then was snapped up by Columbia University in 1881 to organize their architecture program. A movement was starting. Hunt was training one by one by one. These programs were opening across the United States, and you'll see at the bottom I put a few examples of the early ones. And these architects learned the Beaux-Arts method, went back to their hometown or went to Paris to learn more. And they did go, not only, I wanted to mention California, Free Westerners, I believe the first there was Berkeley, which was started by John Gilman Howard in 1903, and he was an Ecole graduate. For those who could not afford the time or the cost of a degree program, they opened a grant, starting with Hunt and his friends, started Beaux-Arts Institutes, and this is one example in New York of a later building that was their headquarters. He started that in 1857. And those opened up across major cities throughout the United States to teach working draftsmen, builders, and apprentices in the Beaux-Arts method. There was no national school of architecture in the United States as there was at the Ecole. There was talk about it, but the United States could never quite get it together. But through these training programs, these private ateliers and university systems, the Ecole came to dominate architectural education in the United States for about 75 years. There was no U.S. institute equivalent of the Institut de France, so Hunt also co-founded the American Institute of Architects to advocate for the profession of architecture, for standards and practices, and that eventually led to licensing. And on the lower left, I just put in one of their medals because they all seem to love to give each other medals, and I thought that was a nice one. A generation later, to give Americans the opportunity to have their own Rome Prize for non-French citizens, Charles Wellham Kim spearheaded the founding of the American Academy in Rome to offer U.S. artists and architects the opportunity to study in Rome. And like the AIA, the American Institute, the American Academy in Rome is alive to this day and thriving. So back to Richard Morris Hunt. It's 1855, on the eve of the Civil War. Hunt arrives back in the United States, all fired up with all his French experiences. So the first thing he does is go to Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. was a mess. He volunteered himself as the best trained architect for monumental classicism in the United States, marched up to the Capitol, which had just removed a failed early attempt at a dome and was deciding what kind of new dome to put back up there, And he marched up to the government-appointed architect and said, I'm here, I'm ready to take over, I know how to do this. It did not go well. So Hunt played the long game. He went back to New York, rallied his troops, cultivated influential patrons, and 38 years later, showed the federal government what he and the Beaux-Arts approach might do. The White City, in the upper left, was in fact a design proposal and a manifesto. And the buildings surrounding Hunt's administration building in the center, going from left to right, include McKinney, White, Peabody from Boston, both Ecole graduates, and on the right, Hunt's former students, including Van Brunt and George B. Post. So Hunt is at the World's Columbian Exposition surrounded by his followers, and he is showing influential politics and the public what is possible. Within a year, many of the same team who had overseen the World's Columbian Exposition Court of Honor undertook a new initiative to persuade Congress to transform Washington, D.C. into a capital worthy of the nation. And they found a far more receptive audience in Washington than they had in the 1850s. That World's Columbian Exposition, the country's population was 63 million at the time, and it's estimated that 27 million people attended that fair. The axial reflecting pool, defined by monuments culminating in the Capitol, takes the principles of classical design codified under Louis XIV and completely reinvented and transformed into our national capital. And by 1901, many of the surviving team behind the White City, and we have Burnham and McKim. Below McKim, we have with the beard, Augustus St. Gaudens, an Ecole graduate in sculpture, and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. They were appointed to something called the Senate Park Commission, named the Macmillan Commission after an early Senate advocate, to oversee the Beaux-Artification of Washington, D.C. Sadly, Hunt and Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. did not live long enough to see the White City in Washington. But the vision that they had determined the shape of the city for the next half-century and continues to do so today. The city's major thoroughfares and axes were populated with White City-worthy monumental classical buildings by leading Beaux-Arts architects, beginning with Burnham's Union Station, because one of the first things they needed to do was get the railroad tracks out of the center of the city and create a monumental entrance to the city. From Delano and Aldrich, as an example, they built the new post office, and later, even in light of the Depression and with the support of the federal government, John Russell Pope, the National Archives, and the National Gallery of Art. And monuments. There's no question that this was a product of the Beaux-Arts team. Henry Bacon, who designed the Lincoln Memorial, had been McKim's right-hand man at the World's Columbian Exposition. Carrera and Hastings at Arlington Memorial Amphitheater, and John Russell Pope, the Jefferson Memorial, were Beaux-Arts alums. And Hastings, when he was questioned about the Beaux-Arts style and whether it was appropriate to be using this French classical architecture in the American capital, said, the precedent was given to us by Washington and Jefferson. It is part of our history. The legibility of the image of the federal system extended to state capitals. 26 out of 50 state capitals were built in the Beaux-Arts style, 6 of them by Cass Gilbert. Although each one is slightly different, the idea that each one should refer to the national capital was particularly significant to a generation following the Civil War. Urban planning. You can, on the left, there is right in the center, there is just a faint outline in the center of little puffs of white, and that is where the train tracks were running across the center of the mall in Washington, D.C., where today we have the long open access of the mall. Inexorably linked to the White City and the Macmillan Plan was the establishment of the so-called City Beautiful movement, which sought to apply the principles of urban design, seen first at Versailles and then in Haussmann's Paris, Beaux-Arts principles, to American cities. So we have Washington before and after. For those concerned about adopting royal imagery, Washington had the perfect justification. The unrealized 1791 plan for the city, commissioned by George Washington himself, and the first board of overseers of the District of Columbia. And that's on the left, and a close-up of the Macmillan plan on the right, as it was updated and cleaned up, essentially. Other cities took note: Chicago, Hartford, Connecticut, Detroit, Des Moines, Buffalo, Kansas City, all had at least partially implemented city beautiful plans. Here we have Cleveland, if you know Cleveland at all, the mall in Cleveland, as part of that still remains. Baltimore, if you know Lafayette Square, is left from the city beautiful period. And in Philadelphia, where the Benjamin Franklin Parkway remains perhaps the best realized and intact of the many city beautiful plans conceived in the 3 decades or so following the World's Columbian Exposition, with the statue, again, of George Washington in front of the Art Museum. We saw in Paris that palaces could become museums, hotels, apartment buildings, but in the United States, we had a definite shortage of old palaces to work with. And so Beaux-Arts architects built new ones to house public libraries, theaters, opera houses, and museums, which they explicitly called palaces of the people. Cultural institutions brought a European tradition to Americans stood at the heart of the Beaux-Arts city, such as Richard Morris Hunt's Fifth Avenue entrance to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to the War Memorial Opera House in San Francisco, the Cultural Center, originally the Chicago Public Library, and McKinley White's Boston Public Library. Culture was now part of civic pride. And variations of stylistic themes served to bring a taste of European sophistication to other social activities in the Gilded Age. From hotels, I think you all know the Breakers, which is derived in very clever ways from the Villa Medici, which was coincidentally the French Academy's home in Rome, to Italian Renaissance clubs, to French Romanesque with some Spanish examples in H.H. Richardson's Trinity Church in Boston, to the triumphal Roman inspiration of Grand Central Station in Manhattan. And, of course, residences. From French Renaissance chateau to Italian palazzi, Beaux-Arts architects offered American clients a range of architectural traditions to characterize their place in the world landscape, and then based on location and personal preference. Beaux-Arts architects responded to and honored the varied cultural character of the United States by reaching into their non-French repertoire. In Florida, beginning with Henry Flagler's Constellion Hotel in St. Augustine, designed by Carrere and Hastings, drew on Florida's heritage as a Spanish settlement in the age of exploration as a starting point for a fanciful historicism that gave rise to the Mediterranean revival style, which was reviving nothing that had previously existed there, but rather building a glamorous architectural reimagining to celebrate and represent Florida's Spanish roots as the wellspring of future growth and development. And I think there are plenty of examples in Florida of houses and now museums that have their own variations within this Spanish-inspired style. It caught on in California as well, in government buildings, hotels, and perhaps most influentially in Julia Morgan's work at San Simeon, drawing on the Spanish missions as a starting point for the Casa Grande at San Simeon. Both the direct and indirect influences helped Beaux-Arts architecture to define California Mediterranean architecture as the architecture of Hollywood, which conquered popular culture in the teens, 20s, and beyond. In the East, the colonial and federal eras contained just enough classicism to make it rich fodder for Beaux-Arts architects to create a new style, the colonial revival, which soon became a standard mode for residential architecture in the first half of the 20th century, with many regional variations. So, for example, on the left, Delano and Aldrich, the federal style in the Northeast, the Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts, also in the Northeast, and Neil Reed. I used a residence in Buckhead in Atlanta because we couldn't do better in the colonial revival than by copying George Washington and Mount Vernon, and so it showed up quite a bit. But Beaux-Arts architects weren't always looking backwards. We saw Labrouste adopting cast iron in the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève, and new technology was the focus for many architects. In the United States, in the far left, we have the Reliance Building in Chicago, which is happening to be built exactly the same time as the White City and the World's Columbian Exposition. He's building one of the first skyscrapers, and it is making a radical liberal use of the newfound technology of plate glass. So in Chicago, Burnham, his colleagues, and other architects are essentially inventing the skyscraper, an entirely new building form using new materials and technology. Other pioneers in skyscraper design looked to the verticality of the Gothic cathedral for a vocabulary to express the soaring ambition of the new office tower building type. These variations of cathedrals of commerce remain landmarks of the skyline wherever they have survived, whether it's the Woolworth Building, the American Radiator Building in Manhattan, or everybody, at least my personal favorite, William Van Allen's Chrysler Building in Manhattan, all designed by Ecole graduates. But not everybody followed the White City path. H.H. Richardson found a key characteristic of American architecture literally in the landscape, in the geology. He moved away from this historic Romanesque style and seemed to be growing progressively less Romanesque and more geomorphic when he died in 1886. It was an outgrowth of this Beaux-Arts idea of adapting to local circumstances, and in his case also looking at the West. He saw photographs through his friends of geological formations and things that were being discovered as part of building the railroads and opening the West, and felt that that was the best way to express America as it would be in the decades ahead. McKim and White, McKim and White had worked for Richardson, experimented with a similar idea in Newport, developing what they called the modern colonial, not only using classical ornament from the colonial period on surviving buildings, but also the wooden shingles that covered the most humble of antique buildings, blending them with the landscape through this material that aged, the shingles aging and becoming part of the landscape. Also, in addition, they looked at the openness of the plan, blurring the line between interior and exterior. And so while pioneering American modernist Frank Lloyd Wright purported to oppose everything about the Beaux-Arts tradition and really only acknowledge Louis Sullivan as an influence, comparison suggests that there was more Beaux-Arts influence in his early work than he cared to admit. And I think if you look at Kim White's Isaac Bell House and Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio, you can see that he had seen something. He had seen the designs published. And this is where the Beaux-Arts influence may be unexpected. I suggest that it inadvertently gave rise, through Sullivan and Richardson, to the international style modernism that eventually replaced it. Tom Wolfe told this story better and in more detail in From Bauhaus to Our House, which is always a good read. But here's my Cliff Notes version of how the Beaux-Arts came to influence European modernism and the architects and designers who came to the United States. So we begin, as I mentioned, you have Sullivan and McKim influencing Frank Lloyd Wright. Okay, we've got Frank Lloyd Wright, who's invented the Prairie School. Part of it is he's taking this idea of opening the plan to incorporate, blur the line between inside and outside. He gets in trouble for running off with a client's wife. Things are not going well, so he publishes a book in 1910, and he publishes the book in Germany. German architects are pretty excited about it, including Mies van der Rohe, who designs buildings inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright. At the same time that the Germans and the Swiss are also very interested in the development of the American skyscraper, because they are looking for modern technology, for new materials, for mass production and design that is available to the people. They then found in 1919 the Bauhaus, which is openly in opposition to the Ecole. They said the Ecole is for fancy people, we are about mass producing things for the people. That's going fairly well until the Nazis come to power and said, no, you're not. They shut down the Bauhaus. And we, in the United States, invite two of its three directors, Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe, to come to the United States, where they take over some of our most influential architecture schools, replacing Beaux-Arts trained architects who had been there for 75 years. And so that is how modernism arrives in the United States and trains a whole new generation in a different way of looking at things. Even though the first international style skyscraper was designed by Beaux-Arts trained architect on the far left, Alan Lescaz, the Philadelphia Savings Fund Society, the tide turned and the Beaux-Arts was characterized as the enemy of the modern. The old royal and aristocratic labels were dredged out to characterize it as decadent and un-American. On the far right, the innate classicism of Mies's Seagram building, however, suggests the Beaux-Arts did, in fact, have the adaptability to handle the novelty of 20th century design and technology. And on the far right, the Seagram building, which Mies explained, was symmetrical, which was using modern materials to create verticals. He said that the I-beams were like the columns in a Greek column, or in a Greek temple. All of these things influenced the Beaux-Arts, but nobody really wanted to admit it. And in the center, the Modern Architecture International Exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, which was curated by the not quite yet, but later architect Philip Johnson. In the middle, a model of the famous building that, by Corbusier, who said that a house was not about art or architecture, but was a machine for living. Finally, restoration and reuse. Throughout the 19th century, the École grew within France and the US a desire to rebuild the best architecture of the past and build on those foundations. McKim, Mead, and White not only rebuilt Jefferson's Rotunda at the University of Virginia following a fire in 1895, but designed their own version of the circular library form. First they restored it and extended a little bit, they tweaked it, cleaned it up, or Jefferson maybe made a few mistakes and clipped a few corners. But then at Columbia, built an original design with its roots firmly planted in multiple layers of the classical tradition. Jefferson may have invented the round library as the centerpiece of a university. McKim took it a step further and added some Roman and some French flavor as well. Restorations by Beaux-Arts architects in the 20th century helped shape multiple generations' vision of what our own history looked like. From the refined arcades of Independence Hall that you can see on the other side, there's a sort of a 5-part Palladian form with the hall in the center and then arcades and flanking symmetrical buildings. That's not what it looked like before 1898. To the Governor's Palace in colonial Williamsburg, which was reconstructed. And when archaeology revealed that it didn't quite line up on the center axis, and the door wasn't exactly in the center, and the windows didn't quite match, the Ecole trained architects decided, well, you know, if they had the time and the money, it would have been perfect. So let's make it perfect. And the destruction of the Beaux-Arts building, McKim, Mead, and White's Penn Station, served as a spur for Congress to pass the Historic Preservation Act of 1966. New York landmarks and other cities and states followed, creating incentives to reflect and retain rather than replace Beaux-Arts landmarks. And here, protesters, ironically, including Philip Johnson, who was a big part of the problem, posing to protest the demolition of Penn Station, which they're talking about redoing Penn Station, and the debate is whether or not they could reconstruct the McKim, Mead, and White version. And in the Beaux-Arts tradition of finding new use for old buildings, adaptive reuse has become the most sustainable tool in this generation's notion of historic preservation. Old buildings have become hotels, condos, shops, office buildings, and more. One example, a shuttered Carnegie Library in Washington, D.C. struggled to find a new purpose and failed as a museum twice, until Apple, seizing on the logic that just as libraries were the crossroads of information exchange in the Gilded Age, so is Apple's technology for today's audience. And so it is now thriving and a popular Apple store. And so we return to the Flagler Museum, built at a time in Palm Beach when there was nothing like it. It was designed to evoke the cultural traditions that gave rise to new ambitions and modern ideals that might be attained here in the Gilded Age and beyond. And I believe it stands as evidence that the greatest and most universal legacy of the Beaux-Arts in American architecture is the abiding value of heritage in forging an enduring identity and dignity of place. Thank you. Very much. It's a big story, and I covered a lot of ground. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Mr. Blake?
I have a question. Tell us about the auditorium, the Ecole Beaux-Arts, and the painting there, and how that figured into the experience for the students.
Mr. Blaze has asked about the auditorium at the Ecole de Beaux-Arts, which we have a reproduction of that in the Carrera and Hastings exhibition, didn't we? There was a painting showing, there was a room in which the winner of the Prix de Rome and the graduates of the École received their prizes. And above them, there was a mural, and in the center were the arts and allegorical figures, one reaching down to put the laurel wreath, like antiquity, on the winner's head, and surrounded by figures, artists and architects throughout history, going back to Donatello and Michelangelo and Bernini and all the great architects and artists. So there was this pressure, but this sense, again, that there was an ongoing tradition that went back from classical antiquity. They had guys in togas in this thing as well. That this, you were becoming part of this tradition, and it was your job to sort of carry this tradition forward. And many of them did, and what I think is interesting is that modernism itself, although it tried to say it was rebelling against the Beaux-Arts, was in essence a branch of the Beaux-Arts that moved forward. Yes?
What happened to the Ecole school and also the building?
Question is, what happened to the Ecole school and the building? Thank you for asking. The Ecole did not do very well in 1968 when there was a student uprising in Paris. It was, the architecture part was shut down because they discovered that the architects were using their printing program and equipment to come up with posters supporting the rebels that were rebelling against the French government. It now exists as a series of government-approved independent studios. So that central Ecole point of contact was dissolved. And the government does certify various programs. I believe there are half a dozen in Paris and others in cities throughout France. But there is no longer a central École des Beaux-Arts. And the building is still there. The art school still holds some classes there. And you can sneak in, which I highly recommend. They don't lock it. Last time I was there, it was nighttime. I took terrible pictures because it was too dark, but it's kind of cool. You can go and walk around. And the Museum of Fragments that was displayed was moved about 5 years ago to the Chaillot. I think it's the Palais de Chaillot. But you can look it up, and there is where they have the plaster models and architectural fragments that had been on display. It's over near the Eiffel Tower, but no longer at the Ecole. Yes.
So, Flagler produced here in Hastings for this building, right? And I saw he did it in St. Augustine as well. Was that his architecture choice for most of his buildings?
Well, you'll have to come back. Yes, Flagler knew Thomas Hastings' father. Thomas Hastings' father was a Presbyterian minister, and Flagler knew him first. And so when Hastings opened a practice with Carrere, Flagler was really their first patron. He started by hiring them to do an addition to his house in the Maronette, and then later, to their surprise, called and said, hey, if I give you $1 million, build a big resort in St. Augustine. It was a remarkable way to begin, and one of the most remarkable buildings, in my opinion, in the United States. Yes?
Wait, we have an online question, Scott.
Oh,
Yeah, your question is, how does the Art Deco movement in architecture fit into the chronology of design history, and is the Beaux-Arts style influential to its development?
The question was, if I'm getting this correctly, how does Art Deco fit into all of this? Art Deco began in France with an exhibition of decorative arts in 1925. It started with furniture and interiors. Architecture in the École developed a style for a while that was known as strict classicism. that to me always looks like Art Deco. And if you're familiar in Washington, when at the Folger Shakespeare Library or the Federal Reserve Building, just the building, not the policies, there was an attempt to take the Art Deco style and streamline and make classicism modern and fit more into what was currently fashionable. And in addition, with the skyscrapers, as you saw at the Chrysler Building, it was taking very intricate patterns of medieval cathedrals and paring them down and making them more purely geometric and streamlined and adapting to the Art Deco. So it was a bridge, I would say, between the classicism that we associate with the height of the Beaux-Arts movement in the 1890s and teens and the rise of modernism right around World War II. Yes, sir.
How is the restoration of Notre Dame progressing in Paris?
The question is about the restoration of Notre Dame. I've been following that in the news, and it seems like they are still arguing about it. I know one of the big debates was the spire in the middle that collapsed. That had been designed by Viollet-le-Duc, who said he was against the École but taught there for a while. He designed that between 1859 and 60, and so once it collapsed, the question was, well, it's not authentic to the medieval building. And after back and forth, and some arguments, well, maybe we should make something brand spanking new and modern, it was decided that it had become so familiar to us all, and such a part of the landmark exterior of Notre Dame that they would rebuild this central spire at the crossing to Viollet-le-Duc's design. As of the last article I read a week or two ago, they are restoring the stained glass windows, the sculpture, all of those things on the inside, but there is enormous pressure to include contemporary art as well. And the bishop has said, we are a church, not an art museum. We don't have an obligation to represent contemporary art, but I suspect that many people who supported the movement and various other cultural forces will mean that in addition to restoring what was there at Notre Dame from the Middle Ages and various campaigns of restoration, we will see some modern design as well. And it's now not going to be done in time for the Olympics as they promised, but they think it will be done in 2024. One last question, because Mr. Blades is ready for us to move along. Yes, sir.
Would you say that the Ecole was, or it looks like it was heavily influenced and directed by Baroque?
The question was the Ecole heavily influenced by the Baroque? Yes and no. I think that they definitely, certainly under Louis XIV, they were the Baroque. That's the Baroque that everybody wanted. And it's fantastic. But then the Revolution came, and under Napoleon, he wanted to go back to Rome and neoclassicism and something simplified. If you look at the Church of the Madeleine in Paris that looks like a temple, it started as a church and was originally supposed to have all sorts of elaborate gewgaws on it. And then Napoleon stepped in and said, no, we've gone far enough. Simple temple, that's what we're sticking with. So they kind of shifted gears there. And then throughout the 19th century, I think we're constantly trying to adopt and adapt and make this message that yes, we have the Middle Ages, yes, we have the Baroque, yes, we have the Renaissance and the Chateau, but these are all now for the people. Thank you.
Thank you all for your patience. You took my clicker.
Oh, what's up?
So it advances this. Thank you.
you all join us for the next lecture. Thank you again to our sponsors, Related First Republic and Smith Architectural Group. The next lecture will be by Dr. David Brownlee on Horace Trumbauer's firm. I want to say thanks again to Lori and to all of you for attending, and to the staff who work hard behind the scenes to make this all work. We look forward to seeing you at other programs here. And I hope to see you throughout the season. So thank you again for coming, and Lori